Okay, so this is a video that's really just about introducing the basic concept of the Revit design interface. This is definitely a beginner level tutorial if you're really looking at Revit for the first time. So we're not going to go extensively over the interface. We're really going to go over those key elements that you need to know to get started. So when you first launch Revit, you see sort of this opening screen, recent files that have opened, and some basic information on here, what you can start to do. Also from the Revit drop down, you'll see a series of options. Sorry, this always takes a few seconds to pop up on my computer. You'll hear me a lot of times in the videos refer to this as the big R. And what we're going to start with here is simply a new project. The tutorials that I'm doing and what we have installed at the university is what I like to call Revit everything. There are three particular modes of Revit out right now. There's Revit Architecture, I guess four: Revit Architecture, Revit MEP, Revit Structure, and then there's a version of Revit that combines all of those tool sets into one program, and that's the version that we have installed. So in particular, I mentioned that because this is something new in this version in terms of when you're launching a project. It's the template file to start with. Excuse me. And what we want to launch is the architectural template. That gives us, as architectural designers, that gives us the base starting point that we really want in terms of the views and things and how those views are arranged right off the bat. So with architectural template selected, we're going to press OK. And that gives us a launch into the program. So again, going over some quick things, we're in a plan view, and you can tell what view you're in by what is bold in the project browser window, which is this piece right here, which you can drag out if you want to see a larger version of what that is. So what is bold is the view that you're currently in. So right now I know I'm in level 1, which is a plan view, and I know that in working in my plan view, I can zoom in and zoom out with the wheel, and then if I hold the middle mouse button down, I can pan. So this is a two-dimensional view, and so I really only have the zoom in, zoom out, and pan. I'm going to go ahead and lock my project browser back down to the bottom, I hope. Let's do this. I'm going to go ahead and close it because this is something that I often see students having trouble with. So when we're working in the interface, there are a couple of things to take note of that I see problems with students having quite often. The first is we lose a couple of menu sets, something like this. And as you get more advanced in Revit, you can certainly start to customize your workspace. So one of those ways is to begin closing down some of the menus if it's typically something that you don't need or don't use very much, if you want more workspace. The other item is this little button right here, which modifies the appearance of your workspace all the way down to something very minimal. While you're learning Revit, I would certainly recommend keeping the default views open. Each time you go to a different computer, whether it's the computer lab or whether you're in an office, you want these configured pretty much the same way across the board. And how we have our computer set up at the university is pretty much everything open. So one of the things that's happened here is I've lost those two panels, which happens often, and everybody seems to panic when that happens. Pulling them back up is a matter of working through the user interface. And the user interface button I thought it was under Manage, probably under View. There we go, underneath the View tab. So across the top we have a series of tabs: View, User Interface, and I'm going to turn back on Properties, and I'm going to turn back on the project browser. I would still really rather have those stacked. There we go. By dragging it over just off the side of the page, you should be able to get those two to stack one on top of the other to kind of allow you to maximize this workspace. And I've gotten used to this. This is really comfortable on my professional projects. This is how I work. So again, across the top we have our basic tabs, which each have a series of buttons underneath them. So after the big R right here, we have architecture, structure, systems, insert, annotate, analyze, massing and site, collaborate, view, manage, extensions, and modify. And just like the example that I was working through earlier, I wanted to make some modifications to how things appear, in particular user interface. So appearance, view, user interface. Usually things are laid out in a fairly logical fashion. Now the one thing that does happen is inside of Revit, things are going to modify based on what you're working on. So for instance, if I choose architecture and wall, immediately once I launch the wall tool, my tool set changes, and this green tab pops up, modify or place wall, and all of my tools specific to wall pop up. So at this point I can begin drawing a wall in, and if you notice, my properties panel has changed to the properties for the wall that I'm drawing as well. So again, as I'm drawing this wall in, I know this is a generic wall which is 8 inches wide. As I'm drawing on the center line of the wall. That's the default. So I can push a wall in a certain direction, and again, if I want this to be 20 feet 6 inches, that would be 20 space 6 and enter. And I can continue to work that around. I can also move my cursor to a point where I will get a snap, which is something, or a reference snap, which is something you can see the dashed lines begin to connect these elements together. That is an endpoint snap. And Revit is really nice about going ahead and closing off walls. As I deselect objects, or as I drop a command, you'll notice that modify is selected. So there's two ways to do that. If I'm in the menu and I'm drawing a wall, I can either choose to hit escape once, which still keeps the wall tool active, or I can hit escape twice, which drops the tool altogether, or I can tap or left click modify, and that does the same thing. For me, I typically use the double tap of escape. It becomes sort of second nature as you want to drop a tool to just tap escape twice. So if you also notice, after I've drawn the wall tools, everything goes back to its original status until I pick something. And then it's going to pull up the Modify Walls button, because this is a wall that's already in place, and the entire ribbon up here is going to change based on the Modify Walls properties. So this ribbon at the top is constantly going to flex and move based on its prediction of what you're going to do next. So pulling back out, let's look a little bit at the workspace. You'll notice it typically starts, the architecture template's going to start off with these 4 pieces right here. What those are the elevation tags, the default elevation tags. How they work, I can certainly build anywhere. I can take my object and I can move it outside of those elevation tags. The build space essentially is an infinite build space, although what I will tell you is Revit does not particularly like working at the city scale. It's designed to work at the building scale, so you don't want to get too carried away with it. We've seen people try and fail. Weird things start to happen, let's just put it that way. But this interface in particular with these 4 squares, as your building grows outside of those or as you need to adjust them, they're pretty simple to do. I can click on them once and I can drag them around. I can also click on the box and I can add new elevations around the edge. So let me go ahead and delete those. Okay. And as I delete each one of those, you'll notice it's saying elevation is going to be deleted. We'll talk about what that means here in just a second. So this triangle that's associated with the square is essentially the elevation cut line. So I can click once on that triangle and I will get this blue line, which indicates where the elevation is being taken from. So remember, in Revit, everything's 3D. So essentially, every two-dimensional view is a sectional view someplace. Right now, again, my bold is level 1, so I'm a floor plan view, which is a section cut, by default 4 feet above the finished floor elevation of level 1, looking down. So an elevation, again, is actually a section looking this direction, as denoted by this arrow, and that essentially is my section plane. So if I go to my east elevation, you can see that is my view. So I have level 1, level 2, the 20-foot tall walls that I've built. I'm going to go back to level 1. If I select that arrow, if I actually move this into the building and go back to my east elevation, I've actually now cut a section through the building. So that's something that, again, it's easy to kind of get these elevations messed up. To fix them, go ahead and just select on that arrow and move that blue line to where you want the elevation projected from. So by the same token, in terms of drawing, a lot of times we actually want to go ahead and cut a section, and we want to make sure we're seeing the symbol of that section as well. So let's go ahead and cut a section. And again, to do that, there's a shortcut to the tool right here, but just to sort of follow the logic of the program, I'm actually creating a new view. So I would go to the View tab, Section, and that's sort of the best way to remember where those tools are. So once I create that section, you can see that's the parameter, or how the view range of the section, the direction, and that's actually my section cut line. Now, it's immediately added this section into my project browser, into my views. So I can double click on section here, but how Revit is starting to work, and I've found this to be really handy, is all of these elements also act sort of like links on a web page or something like that, where I can actually just double click that and it'll take me right to that section view as well, which is a really kind of nice thing. By the same token, let's go back to level 1. Underneath my view tabs, I also have a series of 3D views. So the default 3D view is an axonometric drawing, and so this is sort of the first volumetric kind of view that we have displayed. Again, I can zoom in and out with the wheel. I can hold the wheel down and pan, or I can use shift and the wheel and I will orbit. Now, a couple of things to note again about zooming. If I place my cursor over something and zoom in, it's going to zoom in that location. And if I have an object selected, it's going to orbit around that object. Both of those are really important items to know to sort of speed up how you navigate around the workspace. Now there's another type of 3D view. I'm going to go back to level 1, and that is the camera. And so the camera is actually creating a 3D workspace, or a 3D view. And in that camera view, the default is, I believe, 5 feet. The eye height is about 5 foot 8 inches above the floor finish level that you place the camera at, which was level 1. It's going to give me a new 3D view right here. Typically, you want to rename that. So I'm going to rename this view to something that makes sense, because after you add in about 20 or 30 3D views, you will lose track. So let's call this Exterior East Perspective. So this is not an axonometric, this is a perspective. You'll notice there's no scale down here at the bottom, just the word perspective. The default 3D view is an axonometric drawing, so it does have a scale. If I need to edit this view, there are a couple of ways I can do that. If I go to my level 1 floor plan, I can come down to my exterior views. I'm going to right click and say Show Camera. That allows me to do two things. First of all, I can move the camera around to a new location. I can also move the viewpoint, or what the camera is looking at, to a new location. And then when I double click on the camera, I actually have to double click back on the view. It will edit and update that view. By the same token, when I'm in the 3D view, I've got this crop region, and I can use the grips to edit what the camera is actually seeing. This also is the size of the view, which as you get into creating perspective renderings becomes really important as well. If I click this, crop box, again the ribbon changes. I can see size crop, and I can either change my field of view or my scale. Typically, I want to come in and change my scale to increase the resolution of my rendering. So let's say that we actually want that to be 17 inches wide. So you notice it doesn't really look like it's changing much, but it will change the resolution at which you can render. So the last thing that I want to look at, let's go back to level 1, is the properties panel. So I have a series of properties. If nothing is selected, this properties panel is your view properties. So we can see this is an 1/8 inch scale, normal display mode. I've got a few additional things that are important that we'll get further into this course series, such as view range. That's essentially talking about your section plane, where you're cutting the section at. This properties panel changes as soon as I select an object. That becomes the properties for this wall. Now you can build an infinite number of wall types. The basic architectural model comes with a good set of walls for you to work with right from the beginning. So let's just change that to an exterior brick on CMU. So you can see it immediately changes the thickness of the walls. If I change the way my detail drawing is done here at the bottom, change that to medium, you can actually see the coursing of the walls. If I move back to my default 3D view, you should even begin to see a change in the representation of that wall. I can now see bricks on that actual wall surface. So, selecting a wall, changing its properties, actually update what the wall is. So that's been now changed to a basic curtain wall. And again, you can change these types infinitely as you work through. So changing, as you work through your design, modifications that you're making can happen very, very quickly. So the last thing to note, that I want to note in particular, is how you begin to input information. Once you launch a tool, architecture, wall, you'll see a series of elements right along this edge. You want to use what you're comfortable with drawing. And typically, there are times where I come in and edit all of this information. But a lot of times, it's perfectly acceptable to make only a minor modification. Like, instead of drawing the wall center line, I might do a finished face, something like that. But looking at elements like 20 feet, things like that, they are so easy to edit as you move through that it's not a terrible worry. For instance, I have these put in. I can go to an elevation view. I can select all of my walls. Let's do it this route. I can select a wall and simply say, I want this wall to have a top constraint of level 2. And it will pull that wall down. I can select multiple walls, even different wall types, and do that same thing. So everything is designed to flex and move inside the workspace as you're drawing. The storefront wall right here will work as well, but you'll notice it will give me an error message because, well, it should have given me an error message because it's actually deleting parts of the model in terms of the mullions when it does that. As you're working through this, any modifications that I make immediately relate across. So if I move my section where we were seeing plain walls beforehand, if I move my section over to where I'm cutting through a curtain wall, that section is immediately updated, because again, all that I'm seeing with each of these views that show up in the project browser are simply different cuts and slices of one 3D model. So each view is interconnected and related, and they're all coming from this overall 3D model that I'm creating. Each piece of the project browser right through here are simply different ways to view and organize this single 3D file.